Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Grandner, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today about the issue of heart health and narcolepsy. I want to thank Wake Up Narcolepsy for inviting me to give this presentation. Sorry I can't be doing this live. This is a recording, but you'll have my contact information on here. Always feel free to reach out. Hopefully, this webinar is helpful to anyone who's seeing it live or anyone who's seeing it on the recording. Let me get started. I want to start with this idea about sleep and why it's so important. Sleep is a non-negotiable biological state required for the maintenance of human life. Our need for sleep parallels that for air, food, and water. And I like starting here because narcolepsy is about a disruption in our ability to get our proper sleep at the same time as proper wakefulness. And these are fundamental states of existence for life, for human life especially. And when these things are fundamentally disrupted, it can cause a wide range of problems. That's why narcolepsy could be related to something like heart health. What do these things have to do with each other? Well, it turns out a lot. But let's take a little bit of a step back. Why do we know that sleep is important for the heart? Well, a lot of this started with data showing that sleep is related to longevity in the general population. We have over 50 years of data showing that shorter sleep and longer sleep are associated with increased mortality. And the further deviation from this normative range, the greater the increase in that mortality risk. So here is the largest study that was ever done, looking at over 1 million people, tracking them over 10 years. And what you can see here is this U-shaped relationship between how much sleep people are getting and how long they're living and their likelihood of dying sooner. What you can see is there's a lot out there about insufficient sleep, but there's not as much out there about excessive sleep. And what you can see is that risks of excessive sleep associated with uh, um, shorter longevity is actually pretty robust. You see this over and over again in the literature. It's actually more reliable to detect a relationship between excessive sleep and mortality versus insufficient sleep. Why that is and how that relates to narcolepsy, actually, we need to study that a little bit more. Most of the attention has been on shorter sleep. But why is it the case? Why is this mortality link evident? Well, sleep is related to a lot of different domains of health. Remember, it's fundamental. It's associated with metabolic health, cardiovascular health, immunologic health, mental health, behavioral health, and cognitive health. I'm going to talk about some of these, not really all of these. I'm going to try and focus most on cardiometabolic health here, but all of these are related to each other. And this is a concept that's going to come up over and over again in this presentation. A little bit about obesity. There's over 100 studies now, probably even more, showing a relationship between lack of sleep and obesity, or sleep disturbance and obesity, and weight gain, and pretty much anything having to do with weight management. This is just data from an old meta-analysis from a bunch of years ago showing that if you follow people over time, people who aren't obese are more likely to become obese if they're not getting enough healthy sleep. Actually, the likelihood of obesity goes up by about 55% when you combine all these studies together. Similarly, when you look at high blood pressure, you have an elevated risk of 20%. If you are not getting enough healthy sleep, you're about 20% more likely to develop high blood pressure. In terms of diabetes, similarly, if you are not getting enough healthy sleep, you are about 30% more likely to develop diabetes if you didn't have it before. These are just some analyses showing combinations across large numbers of studies, and you can know that this has been replicated a bunch of times. So this is a pretty well-established relationship that lack of healthy sleep is associated with a number of these outcomes. There is a complicating factor here, though, with age. So here's some data we published looking at the relationship between sleep and hypertension. showing that there is this U-shaped relationship between sleep and hypertension, such that people who are getting less than the recommended amount of sleep or excessive sleep, especially greater than or equal to 10 hours, are more likely to have high blood pressure. But what you can see is this relationship is dynamic and isn't the same across different age groups. What you can see is, for example, younger people don't really seem to have risks associated with longer sleep. And as people get older, the risks associated with sleep tend to decrease over time. Some other studies out there have shown relationships between sleep and energy. So here's a study where they brought people into the lab and reduced them to 5 hours versus 9 hours of sleep. And what you can see when they track their eating patterns, that people who were getting the 5 hours of sleep were much more likely to eat post-dinner snacks, eating food later at night, as composed to the other group. You could see there's no real difference at lunch and dinner and daytime snacks. And if anything, the sleep-deprived group was actually eating slightly less at breakfast, probably because they ate so much later the night before. This is a pattern we see a bunch of times, that people who aren't sleeping well are more likely to be eating more later at night. And this results in changes in energy expenditure, where this is some data from Pierre St. Onge's lab showing some pretty fundamental data that people who are sleeping less burn more calories at night. Being awake burns more calories, and by not sleeping, they are actually burning more calories. However, the amount of extra food that people are taking in at night is way overcompensating for this difference. So here's another study where they brought a bunch of people into the lab and they had 5 nights to 4 hours a night with unlimited access to the food in the lab kitchen. And you can see control subjects had no change in weight, but the sleep restricted subjects who only were given 4 hours gained an average of a kilogram or about 2 pounds across that week, just even a week. What you can see here, actually, there were race ethnicity differences where if you were black, you gained more weight than if you were white. This was Philadelphia, so it was very black and white. And if you were men, you gained more weight than women. Why this is the case? I don't think we're sure, but I think it's interesting that there's this pattern that that being kept awake and unable to get good sleep leads to changes in eating patterns, which leads us to changes in weight gain. And if you look at the difference in when they were eating and how many calories they were eating, similar pattern where you could see between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., there's only one bar here because the other group was asleep. And so the group that was allowed to be awake during the night, they were eating an extra 500 or so calories, and that's where the weight gain was coming from. There's other impacts too in terms of the relationship between sleep and metabolism that relate to how sleep impacts decision making. So I'm not going to get into this much in this presentation because it's a little bit in another direction, but sleep loss impacts your ability to make healthy decisions. And that interacts with some of these metabolic processes and sleepiness too, but I'll talk about that in a sec. So here's a study where they brought about 20 normal young adults, no medical problems, into the lab. Either they were sleep deprived or not, separated by a week. They were given meals, they weren't more hungry in one time than another time, and they were shown pictures of food. And here's some just showing that when they came on their rested versus sleep deprived night, or sleep deprived day, there was no difference in how hungry they were. And it says before scan because they went into the fMRI, but that's not what we're going to be talking about here. And they were shown pictures of food for a couple seconds and then just asked, how much do you want that food? On a scale of 1 to 4, from strongly do not want to strongly want, and you respond. And what they found was the sleep deprivation in the same person led to increased wanting of the unhealthy food. So what you can see here is there was no difference under rested and deprived conditions under how much they wanted the low calorie food. but there were differences in how much they wanted the high-calorie foods, where when the same person was sleep deprived, they were more likely to say they wanted that high-calorie food. And what you can see on the right here, that the more sleepy they were, the more likely it is that they were going to say they wanted that high-calorie food. This just goes to show that there are important relationships between difficulty sleeping, which leads to excessive daytime sleepiness, and how people relate to food and eating healthy food. So when we talk about relationships with narcolepsy in a little bit, remember this, and this is all the stuff that's happening in the background. It's also important to mention the issue of time-restricted eating. There's a bunch of data now showing that, at least in animal models, when you restrict the total time window where animals are allowed to actually consume food, that's actually a really good thing and improves metabolism. And you can see this in humans too, where when people are presented with a restricted time window for being able to eat, it actually results in lower weight, lower adiposity, better blood pressure, better metabolism all around. So if you're confining your eating to a slightly more restricted window, that's actually good for metabolism. So that's another thing. It's not necessarily narcolepsy related, but could be playing a role. A little bit about insulin and glucose and diabetes. I talked about sleep loss being associated with elevated diabetes. There's a whole literature on this, but I just want to orient you to some of the classic work that was done here. So this is a very famous study that was done where they had 2 nights, either 10 hours in bed or 2 nights of 4 hours in bed. And then after the second night of each condition, caloric intake was replaced with an IV glucose infusion at a constant rate to avoid any kind of fluctuations in hunger and appetite related to when you're eating. So they got a constant infusion of glucose into their blood. And even though sleep duration was manipulated for just 2 nights, the glucose and insulin profiles obtained during this continuous glucose infusion were consistent with the results of an IV glucose tolerance test in a previous study where they looked at 6 nights. And basically, what they showed was in the earlier part of the day, after 2 days of shorter bedtime, glucose levels were higher and insulin levels were lower compared to the 2 days of the longer bedtimes. And what you can see here is that just a couple of days of sleep disruption can throw off your insulin and glucose metabolism. And I think that's the point here. This sort of kicked off an entire field of study looking at sleep and metabolism. And there's tons of papers on this now. But for people who aren't familiar, this is sort of what kicked it off. And this is really the point, that even shorter term fluctuations in sleep can disrupt metabolism. And longer term fluctuations also seem to throw off metabolism. A little bit about inflammation. Sleep deprivation actually induces an acute phase response in the immune system, particularly during REM sleep deprivation. And there's a number of studies now showing that short sleep is associated with a pro-inflammatory state. So not getting enough healthy sleep is associated with elevated inflammation. What actually you can see here, this is some of our data where we looked at population level inflammation, showing that on the left, you can see unadjusted, and then on the right, you see adjusted for demographics and BMI and insomnia and sleep apnea. What you see is both the very short and the longer sleepers and the excessive sleepers are both showing up with higher inflammation. This is something that's been seen a bit, especially this link between inflammation and sleep. The longer sleep and inflammation data are actually a bit stronger, especially in women. Part of what might be going on here is that the dynamics of the immune system are changing. So here's a great study that was done a bunch of years ago where they looked at IL-6, which is an immune marker, across 24 hours. What you can see here is what their patterns look like when they were given 8 hours of sleep versus 6 hours of sleep. And what you can see is under 6 hours of sleep, not only do they have elevated inflammation, but that elevation is only in specific times of day, either in the beginning of the night or at the end of the night. And showing that and really I'm showing you this to make the point that there are these relationships here, and they're very dynamic across the 24 hours. So that was sort of a whirlwind tour of various relationships between sleep in general and heart health. I'm really excited to talk about how, after all these data, for all of these years and decades, what was really interesting is the American Heart Association took notice. About 10 years ago, the American Heart Association developed what they called the Simple Seven. These were the seven components of heart health. And so they included weight, diet, exercise, smoking, blood glucose, blood pressure, and lipids, like cholesterol. And if you were good on all of those, you were good on heart health. And if you were good on more of those or less of those, that was sort of a way to look at your heart health. But what's really awesome is that this year, just this past year, in the summer of 2022, the Simple Seven was rebranded to the Essential Eight. So we still have the same seven in terms of glucose, blood pressure, lipids, weight, diet, physical activity, and smoking, but sleep is now part of this whole constellation. Sleep is part of the core definition of cardiometabolic health now. This is super exciting. I like the branding of the Essential Eight. The Simple Seven was never super simple anyway. And actually, there's a couple of things worth noting here. First, the Essential Eight is this collection of 8 components, but there's 2 other parts of this story. One is psychological health, which is a big part of what the Essential Eight is and how it's defined, where all of the elements of the Essential Eight operate on a continuum of psychological health, which operates in the background of all of these, especially because of autonomic function, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But also, it's important to mention social determinants of health, like where you are and who you are and where you come from and your context. And these things shape all of the relevant components of health as well. And so the Essential Eight recognizes that even though social determinants and psychological health aren't one of the 8, because they're not these sort of unidimensional components, there are things in the background of all the components. So we've got some intersecting problems here. Sleep loss is related to both poor health and impaired brain function. And it's possible that these effects are overlapping. And there's a lot of health conditions that are made worse by increasing stress and greater difficulty making healthy decisions. So the effects on the brain and the body from poor sleep might be overlapping. And that might be part of why sleep disorders like narcolepsy are linked with poor health. It's important to note that this problem might be getting worse. So here's some data that we recently were able to show, showing that overall, the population sleep is declining in the US, especially among underrepresented minority groups, especially Black, African American, and Mexican, Hispanic Americans, particularly due to the rise of people not getting enough sleep in those groups. So how do we talk about this in terms of narcolepsy? So there's a lot of ways that not a lot of components of what is involved in narcolepsy that might be relevant for heart health. First is this idea of narcolepsy tied to orexinergic deficiencies. I'm going to talk a little bit about how orexin issues might be part of this link itself. But more than that, there are other components of narcolepsy that are important for heart health. One being excessive daytime sleepiness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but excessive daytime sleepiness itself might be related. Then you have the disturbed nighttime sleep, separate from the excessive daytime sleepiness, being related to heart health. And then also there's the comorbidities that are associated with narcolepsy that might bridge that path between narcolepsy and heart problems. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit. So first, these orexinergic deficiencies. I'm going to mention this in a little bit, but there's a number of links between the orexin system and some of the processes that are controlling sympathetic activation and these other things in the body that lead to blood pressure and other elements of heart health. So orexin does a lot of things. And part of what orexin might be doing is helping to manage heart health. And when people have problems with orexin, that can directly be causing some problems. But it's not just that, there's also excessive daytime sleepiness. How can excessive sleepiness be related to heart health? Well, there's a number of different pathways, but it shouldn't surprise anybody that when someone's really sleeping during the day, it's much harder for them to make healthy choices, get enough physical activity, eat healthy food. They're feeling very fatigued and lethargic. And all of these things not only can add stress, but can contribute to a situation where people have worse heart health. I mentioned a little bit about the connections between disturbed nighttime sleep and heart health in general, and there's lots of these pathways. So in some elements, the disturbed nighttime sleep associated with narcolepsy itself might be one of the pathways linking narcolepsy with heart problems. And then there's the comorbidities. Narcolepsy is related to a lot of other conditions. Narcolepsy itself might induce cardiometabolic risk due to the poor sleep, daytime sleepiness, and orexinergic stuff, but also due to some of these comorbidities. So here's an image showing all the different other conditions that narcolepsy is related to, and different types of conditions. And many of these have their own unique links with heart health. I'm going to be talking about some of them because some of them overlap, because some of them are part of are associated with excessive sleepiness, and some of them are associated with worse sleep at night. And could be overlapping in some of those pathways. One of these being insomnia. Insomnia, so this might be the disturbed sleep of narcolepsy, but this also might be insomnia as an overlapping condition. Poor sleep quality in general is associated with weight gain and obesity. It's associated with, in particular, a 35% decreased likelihood of successful weight loss at 6 months. It's also associated with heart disease and diabetes. Sleep continuity disturbances are associated with 20% increased likelihood of hypertension. And poor sleep quality is associated with a doubling of an increased likelihood of uncontrolled hemoglobin A1C, which is an important diabetes risk factor. Here's some data from a study we did at the national level showing that there's a large overlap between people who have obesity, who are diabetic, who have had a heart attack, who have coronary artery disease, and who have had a stroke, also being more likely to say they have problems sleeping at night. Even after you adjust for demographics and socioeconomics and other causes of that, and even after you're adjusting for overall health. In a lot of cases, the reason why people say with diabetes have worse sleep, well, they have all kinds of other health issues as well that might be interfering with sleep. But it looks like there is a unique relationship here that's independent of all of these other things. So the disturbed sleep itself could be associated with cardiovascular risk, whether or not it's overlapped with an insomnia disorder. I'm not going to talk a lot about sleep apnea, but sleep apnea is also something that overlaps with narcolepsy a lot. I mean, I see it overlapped in clinic. I wasn't able to find a lot of data that shows how overlapped it is, but I got to tell you, I see it in clinic a lot. And there's a lot of literature showing how sleep apnea itself is an important cardiometabolic risk factor. So cardiovascular and metabolic in terms of not just the cortical activation and the upper airway obstruction itself, but you get this issue in terms of increased oxidative stress. You have elevated CO2, decreased oxygen. You have more inflammation. You have elevated blood pressure. You have more strain on the heart and on lots of these other organs, which cause lots of these other problems. So sleep apnea is an important health condition that is linked with narcolepsy. It does tend to overlap. Other pathways besides just sleep disorders. So one is I want to talk about the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system regulates many restorative and recuperative functions of the body. what it does is it regulates things like your heart rate, your respiration, your metabolism, your stress responses, like fight or flight. That's an autonomic thing. The autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic activation increases cardiovascular risk factors and is focused on action. So this is like the stress system. This is when your fight or flight system is engaged, you get sympathetic arousal. This is what slows down your metabolism, elevates your heart rate, makes it so you can run from danger and all that stuff. But you don't want that to be chronic because that can lead to heart disease. The parasympathetic nervous system is more associated with relaxation and recovery. As you can imagine, sleep is very closely tied to the autonomic nervous system. So, for example, if you look at what your blood pressure and your heart rate are supposed to be doing across 24 hours, so here's an image of two blood pressure tracings. One is someone who's having significant dipping during the night and someone who isn't. So this idea of blood pressure dipping versus non-dipping is a really important feature of the 24-hour pattern of blood pressure. And this is controlled by the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system that naturally occur in a circadian pattern, but also, even more importantly, a sleep-dependent pattern. And when sleep is disrupted, you don't get these fluctuations. Now, it's important that your blood pressure and heart rate dip at night. This is when your body's supposed to be recovering, not when your heart is supposed to be working. And there's a lot of data showing that there's important links between non-dipping or decreased day-night variation in blood pressure and heart rate with all kinds of heart-related problems. So interrupted sleep can alter normal autonomic patterns across 24 hours. So anyone with narcolepsy who has this disrupted sleep at night, that could lead to autonomic dysregulation at night, which could lead to dysregulation of these normal 24-hour patterns in heart function, which then could lead to more strain on the heart and more heart disease. And also, orexin itself is associated with sympathetic activation and non-dipping. So a little more about that. There are orexin terminals and orexin receptors in all regions known to regulate cardiovascular function. They seem to be all over. The orexin system directly connects to several pathways in the autonomic nervous system. In particular, orexin seems to play an important role in stress-induced hypertension, partially mediating how blood pressure responds to stress. So what they see is in these animal models, when they deprive them of orexin, actually you don't see the same blood pressure responses to stress in some of these animal models. So then they thought, well, actually knocking out orexin might lower blood pressure because you're not responding to stress in the same way. And it turns out that doesn't actually work that way. It seems like in the long run, by knocking out orexin, what you're doing is you're reducing the variability in the system, where even though you're not reacting in the same way, you're also not recovering in the same way either. And what really seems to happen is a blunting of that 24-hour pattern. So orexin itself might be part of some of the blood pressure patterns that we're seeing in narcolepsy, not just some of the other things associated with it, like the disrupted sleep at night and the more daytime sleepiness during the day. A little bit about narcolepsy and metabolic dysfunction. There's a number of papers out there showing that narcolepsy might take a number of paths to weight gain and obesity. Some of them are through some of these same pathways, like sympathetic tone, and we also talked about changes in eating behavior, hyperphagia, that just means eating more, putting more in your mouth. We talked about how sleep disruption itself can lead to this, and eating all around the clock might also lead to metabolic problems. And some of this might be directly related to the narcolepsy, or it might just be that narcolepsy is causing daytime sleepiness and nighttime sleep disruption, which itself might be leading to some of those changes in eating. Also, I didn't talk about leptin, but leptin is a hormone that regulates satiety, or how full you feel and how satisfied you are from food. And when your sleep is dysregulated, it can reduce your leptin. It can reduce your leptin and increase leptin resistance, which means that even if you do secrete leptin, it doesn't have the same effect in helping you feel full. So that's why sleep deprived people might even have a harder time feeling full from regular food, which might be part of what's leading to some of the overeating. Other things in terms of the sleepiness and the orexin deficiency might be leading to things like decreased metabolic rate and also decreased activity, partially due to the daytime sleepiness. And decreased activity is itself associated with more weight gain and obesity and disruptions in energy balance. So there are many pathways on a metabolic side linking narcolepsy with weight gain and obesity, not just on a heart side. Another important link to talk about is mental health. There's still very little scientific work looking at links between narcolepsy and mental health. This is despite countless patient reports that narcolepsy significantly impacts mental well-being in many ways. It's also associated with a lot of stigma, and that stigma of narcolepsy is specifically a major source of stress. Here's a model that was published relatively recently that mentions this role of stigma, where they showed that the stigma itself associated with narcolepsy is part of the relationship between narcolepsy, depression, and daytime functioning. So even though there's not a lot of literature on this, there is actually some, and it's really interesting. Difficulties with daytime functioning and health-related quality of life are common in narcolepsy, and this is an important part of mental health and well-being. The relationship between insomnia and depression is one of the most well-established findings in all of sleep research. I mean, there's tons of data on how not being able to sleep well at night is associated with worse mental health outcomes. Poor sleep quality in general is associated with every single symptom of depression. So here's a paper we recently published showing that every aspect of depression was associated with some aspect of sleep disturbance. And for many of them, it wasn't just the inability to sleep at night. In particular, it was the daytime disruptions caused by sleep problems, which actually had a really profound impact on mental health. In addition, that you'll see on here perception symptoms. These are the perceptions of people that something is wrong with my sleep. I'm not happy with it. I'm worried about it. I'm stressed about it. No matter what the problem is, that stress about sleep itself is also a unique thing that causes, I don't know about causes, that is related to mental health issues. So far, there have been over 30 studies that have shown that people with narcolepsy have reduced health-related quality of life. Patients with narcolepsy report worse health-related quality of life. For men, more than 80% have worse scores for body pain, more than a third have worse scores for social functioning, and about 1 in 5 have worse scores for general health. For women, more than half report worse scores for body pain. Almost half report worse scores for social functioning. About 10% have lower vitality scores, and they have about 24% worse scores for general health. So why is this in mental health, and why is this related to heart health? So just to bring things back to the topic, part of health-related quality of life is an important part of mental health and mental well-being that a lot of times the medical establishment sort of forgets about. But for patients, it's really important in terms of your sense of well-being and stress. And mental health is tied to heart health in a lot of ways, particularly through stress and sympathetic activation. And so one of the ways that narcolepsy is linked to worse heart health is through more of this sort of stress and depression. So this is something that's really interesting here is looking at narcolepsy versus depression. So part of the time, the issue is that actually narcolepsy might present as depression medically. I mean, there's a lot of overlaps. So in depression, you get this debilitating fatigue and lack of energy. In narcolepsy, you get severe excessive daytime sleepiness. In depression, you get disturbed sleep and difficulty maintaining sleep. And in narcolepsy, you get disturbed sleep and sleep fragmentation. In depression, you get delusional beliefs. And what I mean, things like, the world is against me. I'm never going to succeed. Everybody hates me. I'm a failure. All of these sorts of these things we tell ourselves when we're depressed that aren't rational. They're things we tell ourselves that we believe. Well, in narcolepsy, there's also non-reality elements to it in terms of sleep-related hallucinations. In depression, you have psychomotor problems, and in narcolepsy, you have psychomotor issues, particularly cataplexy and sleep paralysis. In depression, you have problems with work and school performance. Commonly, it interferes all the time. In narcolepsy, you have problems with work and school performance because it interferes all the time. In depression, you have isolation and you have withdrawal from others. In narcolepsy, you have isolation and difficulty socializing. With depression, you get appetite disruption, where you get weight gain or loss. You do get weight gain in narcolepsy, and we talked about some of the pathways as to why. In depression, there's a lot of feelings of hopelessness, and you get that in narcolepsy as well. Depression, there's a lot of feelings of guilt. Same in narcolepsy. There's a lot of feelings of guilt in patients with narcolepsy. Depression, a lot of perceived laziness that has to do with that disability. And it's the same thing in narcolepsy. There's a lot of perceived laziness in narcolepsy. So I just put this on here to illustrate the important overlaps between narcolepsy and depression. Sometimes it's because someone has narcolepsy and their doctor thinks it's depression because it looks similar, but might also be because they're overlapping with each other. Here's some data from Ohayon showing that people with narcolepsy are much more likely to have all kinds of mental health conditions, more likely than the general population. They're about twice as likely to have ADHD. They're about 4 times as likely to have phobias. They're about 3 times as likely to have an anxiety disorder, about 4 times as likely to have OCD, about 2.5 times as likely to have social anxiety, about 3 times as likely to have panic attacks, 6.5 times as likely to have agoraphobia. Now, agoraphobia is sort of like the opposite of claustrophobia, where claustrophobia is fear of sort of confined spaces. Agoraphobia is sort of like the fear of being out and vulnerable and not having anything to hold on to. PTSD is twice as likely in people with narcolepsy. Bipolar disorder is 4.5 times as likely, and depression is more than twice as likely in people with narcolepsy versus the general population. So I think it's important that mental health is something we still talk about, and it is related to heart health. Another important link here between narcolepsy and heart health is medication. So one is the overlapping of medications with mental health conditions. So there's a lot of overlap between medications used for narcolepsy and those used for a range of psychiatric conditions, and these include all kinds of stimulants and antidepressants and antipsychotics. And a lot of these carry heart risks. But I especially want to talk about sodium. So as a lot of people will know, sodium is a really important element in narcolepsy treatment because of sodium oxybate being, one of the main pharmacological treatments for narcolepsy that's effective and has a lot of great qualities to it and has changed a lot of lives in a positive direction. But sodium might be a problem for narcolepsy treatment. So sodium oxybate is a well-studied and effective treatment for narcolepsy. But there's a problem in that it has very high levels of sodium. Sodium intake is associated with higher blood pressure, increased vascular resistance, increased arterial stiffness, and fluid retention. So here's some data. Well, here's a schematic showing all of the different pathways that link high sodium intake to heart disease risk. And what you can see here is a lot of it has to do with elevating blood pressure. And this is why people who have high blood pressure are looking towards lower sodium diets. Poor sleep health is also associated with higher blood pressure. We talked about this, including narcolepsy. So here you have a condition where you're more likely to have higher blood pressure because of your sleep disorder. And then you're taking a medication that's likely to increase your blood pressure, or that might be more likely to increase your blood pressure. And then you have this issue that reducing salt intake might prevent cardiovascular disease. So what you can see here, so this was a really cool study where they looked at looking at prevented cases of heart disease due to reductions in salt intake, looking at mathematical models showing that changes in salt intake might prevent cardiovascular events. And you can see there's an age gradient and it's different in men and women. But either way, what you can see is you can prevent heart attacks and strokes by reducing salt intake, especially for people at risk. So this is sort of an issue with narcolepsy where, again, you have a condition where you're more likely to have elevated blood pressure. You have a treatment that has a lot of sodium in it, which might elevate your blood pressure. And reducing sodium might actually help in terms of heart health, but you're in a position where you're taking in large amounts of sodium. So that's something I wanted to talk about too, as another potential link between narcolepsy and heart disease that has nothing to do with the narcolepsy itself and has nothing to do with any of the comorbidities associated with narcolepsy, but even the medications. So all of these connections between narcolepsy and heart health. You have disturbed nighttime sleep and excessive daytime sleepiness that's associated with elevated cardiovascular disease risk. And then you have pathways that could include the overlapping sleep disorders themselves, like insomnia, sleep apnea. You also have autonomic dysfunction, where the narcolepsy itself might disrupt your fight or flight response and your stress response and your 24-hour patterns of stress response so that your heart isn't able to recover the same way at night. You might have more chronic stress, and that might impact your heart. Then there's the metabolic dysfunction. Because of whether you have no energy during the day or your sleep is disrupted at night, or because of what Orexin was doing itself, you have disruptions in metabolism and energy management, which could lead to weight gain, which itself then becomes an important heart disease risk. Then you have the mental health issues that often overlap with narcolepsy, which is itself is a very stressful condition, but the mental health issues themselves might be fundamentally linked with narcolepsy in a lot of people. We just don't know enough. So you have mental health issues in narcolepsy, which themselves lead to elevated stress and worse heart health. And then there's also potentially problematic medications, where some of the medications might carry heart-related risks to treat the narcolepsy. So here's an image from a recent review paper that breaks a lot of this down. This was a great review paper that delineated all these different links between narcolepsy and increased cardiovascular risk. And you could see it's a lot of the stuff we talked about through the disturbed nighttime sleep and excessive daytime sleepiness, the autonomic dysfunction, the metabolic dysfunction, and then in the bottom right, you could see some of the psychiatric and sleep disorder stuff. I didn't mention smoking and some of these other issues, inflammation, cardiovascular effects, endothelial function, the medications, the stimulants, the effects in the brain. All of these things interact together to elevate cardiovascular risk. It's not just one thing. There's a lot of different paths here. And narcolepsy is impacting on a lot of these different paths. And so the last thought I want to end with is something, again, pulling back into a little bigger picture, is this idea of sleep and health in context. This isn't just a biological process. You have a sleeping person, and where they are is very important. You know, you have sleep that's related to mental, behavioral, and cognitive health, all this stuff tied to the brain, but also cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune health, all this stuff tied to the body. And the stuff that is driving their sleep are these individual level factors. These are things like your genetics, your demographics, your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, you know, whether or not you have narcolepsy. These are the things that are driving your individual sleep. If you cease to exist, they would no longer be there. But that's not where the story ends. There's also a social level that you're embedded within. If you cease to exist, they would still be there, but you're a part of them. Things like where you live, where you work, your job, your occupation, your family, your neighborhood, your social networks, your culture, your socioeconomic status, your feelings of safety where you are. All of these systems drive a lot of these individual level factors. They might not drive whether or not you have narcolepsy, but they will drive how you react to it, what your thoughts are, what your feelings are, what your behaviors are, what choices you make. They can influence all of these sorts of things that impact your sleep at night. And it's really important when we're talking about making a difference in people's lives, we're not just talking about them in isolation, their own behavior, their own genetics, their own characteristics. It's also this social level that's really important to understand because we're all a part of it and it plays a really important role in all of these choices and things that we're doing. And the social level itself is embedded within a societal level. These are things that exist outside of those things. Things like globalization and 24/7 society, things like racism, technology, geography, climate change, these sort of things that happen outside of all these structures. Like, you know, how many people sleep with one of these devices within arm's reach every day? And this is society that changed. And these societal level changes can influence in a good and bad way how we work, how we relate to people, how we shop, how we get things done across 24 hours, how we interact with the world, which then impacts these individual level factors of our own choices, our own behaviors, our own beliefs, and our own characteristics. And also, there's this sun in the background. There's the day-night cycle and the 24-hour rhythm that supersedes all of that. We all exist within. And all of these together are sort of what are driving sleep health. And it means that you don't have to change everything to be able to better understand how your sleep exists in context. You can change one of them. You can understand these relationships and influence them one at a time and find where those weak links are where you can make a difference. You know, if you can't change your work, maybe there are things you can change. You can't change globalization, but you can change how you interact with technology. So I wanted to put this idea out there because sleep health exists in a context, and this context is really important for understanding all of these connections. So, take home points. First of all, insufficient sleep is associated with incident and prevalent obesity. Pathways include elevated blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, metabolic hormones, inflammation, other unhealthy behaviors, psychosocial stress, neurocognitive problems that predispose to unhealthy eating, and also sleep disorders associated with cardiometabolic disease. And we talked about all of that. In sort of insomnia, sleep apnea, and narcolepsy. Narcolepsy, you know, it hasn't been studied as much in this way, but there's lots of pathways linking narcolepsy with heart health. And so I think it's really important to know. So thank you very much. Here's a quick plug for our lab and our website and all the students and funders. I want to thank Wake Up Narcolepsy for inviting me to talk about this. I think this is an important topic. Um, I'm available for any kind of questions or comments you have. Anyone who knows me knows I'm easy to reach out to. Don't be ashamed or afraid or timid to reach out. Shoot me an email. Follow me on Twitter. Send me a message there. I'm happy to help where I can. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.